When accidents, injuries, or emergencies happen, American Medical Response is there. As part of the Global Medical Response family of companies, AMR is committed to its mission of providing care to the world at a moment's notice. As a leading 911 emergency medical response provider within the community, AMR wants to remind you to stay safe, San Diego. To learn more about AMR, visit amr.net.
Welcome to the Voice of San Diego podcast in partnership with News Radio 600 Kogo. I'm Scott Lewis, CEO and Editor-in-Chief at Voice of San Diego. I'm joined by Assistant Editor Andrew Keats.
Guess where I am?
Where are you at?
The downtown podcast studio from Voice of San Diego.
The great Voice of San Diego podcast studio?
It's been so long, I forgot what it is even called.
The downtown San Diego. Well, cool. How's the office feel? Are we all right?
Yeah. It's cool.
Managing Editor Sarah Libby, hello.
Hello.
You're still in your closet?
I've moved out of the closet and into the spare bedroom.
All right. We have a packed show today. I talked to Mayor Kevin Faulconer about what's going to happen in the city's budget and the homeless residents that he moved into the convention center. Got some news on that. Good discussion. Got all your questions in. Also, one plan for where those homeless residents may eventually go, into some of the bankrupt hotels that have popped up. That idea actually has a lot of City Hall buzzing, but will it actually happen? Can the city pull something off like that? We will talk about it. Some people across San Diego are also talking about opening up the economy. What does that even mean? How do you even do that if you don't open schools, for example? We're not quite sure what is allowed on the street these days when they make their points and what is not and what police are up to. Finally, if testing is the way out of this dystopia, then testing is the main story of the day, and we have a big new chapter in that story. We're going to talk about that. Let's get into it. First of all, let me just make this point, guys, that distance learning is garbaggio. All I'm saying is that my contribution to my children's education amounts to, did you do your multiplication yet? Yesterday, talk about information coming across. Yesterday, we went in and checked on my daughter, and she was hidden in her room. We put these curtains up in her new bed, and we opened them up, and she's in there on the computer with an iPad on the side. She's talking to her friend. She's playing a game. And they're both watching a Netflix show at the same time.
Dope.
She's 7. She's switched from 7 to 14 in 2 weeks.
Yeah. That's great. Sounds like distance learning's great.
Happy for her.
I'm glad the internet is handling this. What would we do without the internet? We would not have a show. All right, let's get into this. There were a few people on the streets and some odd decisions about how to enforce or not enforce the stay-at-home order and the distancing requirements. We're going to talk about that. I talked to the mayor. He said he supports some First Amendment activities, but they need to stay apart. And get this, he also supports the police in their decision, it looks like, to go after one of the organizers of one of these protests. Andy, you saw a sort of spontaneous, not protest, but public demonstration the other day. What happened?
Well, so I was walking my dogs, and people might have heard about this truly horrific non-COVID story. A teenager was found beaten and non-responsive in Golden Hill last week. And then he did eventually succumb to his injuries. And so on Saturday, his family and friends held a candlelight vigil for him at the area where his body was found. And it was the same day that earlier in the day there had been these open up protests, these Liberate San Diego protests. And after those had been allowed to continue, which had generated some controversy online that they were clearly breaking the stay-at-home order, and that but they were not. No one was arrested or cited. I saw this candlelight vigil and I knew what it was for and the circumstances. The attendees were overwhelmingly Black and Latino, and I thought to myself, oh boy, we are in store for quite an ugly juxtaposition if police in any way break up this candlelight vigil or start ticketing people at this candlelight vigil. And they didn't. So what as it was a block from my house, so I was able to see quite a bit of what was going on. And a police car came by and sort of just parked a ways away and watched it. And there were a lot of people who had attended and were standing far away from the crowd and clearly attempting to socially distance themselves. But so that activity, that gathering, was allowed to continue as well. So there was some discretion exercised in that respect also.
Yeah, so I think my take on the whole thing is if you're going to do a First Amendment activity, something really bad has to happen before police start come down on you. Like we do not need any scenes of protesters getting their heads beat. I've seen too many protests over my life that got a lot worse when they tried to shut them down than they ever were before that, and especially at a moment like this. However, if you're not doing that enforcement equitably for people across the spectrum of diversity, you've got big problems. Or perspective. You've got big problems. And for instance, it looks like the sheriffs made a call. So we're talking about police, the San Diego City police in those two instances, the downtown protest and the thing you're talking about. But then we're talking about sheriffs for the thing in Encinitas where they decided to stay away. But then later or earlier, they had decided to ticket people at the Otay Mesa Detention Center who were in their cars, socially distanced. And that's not okay. And when they were asked about that, they're like, we support America or something. What was their garbage response?
They had a joint response that was just, something generic about First Amendment rights and respecting them, although it didn't explain the Otay Mesa ticketing. One thing that's frustrated me about the discussion surrounding this is that people don't seem to be able to distinguish between the act of protest and what it is the protesters are seeking. And so do I think that you have a constitutionally protected right to hang out in a park and go to the beach whenever you want? Probably not. But do you have a constitutionally protected right to, tell your government you believe that you should be able to do that? Yes. And so it seems like people aren't able to understand that those are two separate things.
Yeah. I mean, I do think there is something weird that the police hand out these citations to people who are watching the sunset or, playing a soccer game at a park or something, and then they lay off on these protests. But again, I do understand the latitude on protests, but then they're also not providing the latitude. It looks like they're going after, and the mayor defended their decision to go after the organizer of the downtown protest to open San Diego. And then that brings up the broader discussion. There does seem to be this sort of kitschy, open up, various levels of kind of wild theories about the virus on the streets. And then there's a more sophisticated movement coming together. Richard Bailey in Coronado wrote an op-ed and said that, he doesn't trust the decisions and the way that the county has handled some of these, quote, arbitrary decisions about how to close things. Jim Desmond, county supervisor, and Kristen Gaspar, county supervisor, they put forward a plan. This week, they wanted their fellow county supervisors to agree with them to lobby the governor to open things up by May 1st. And that failed, and it failed the same day that we had our highest death total in a month from the coronavirus. So quite a juxtaposition with that. And I think that, all these discussions are just, it seems moot to me until, they're talking about like hair salons and restaurants and stuff. The biggest question for the economy opening back up are schools, and daycares. You can't. It's like saying to people we should drive everywhere, but there's no roads. You can't have an economy at least the way that we had one if schools and daycares, aren't even on the list of things that you're talking about and when we might be able to get those going again. And so I felt like the whole thing was just remarkably out of touch. I do agree that there should be constant pressure to open things up. We need to go back at some point, but it needs to be informed and thoughtful and safe. And it just seemed really detached from the reality of the situation.
Yeah, the Gaspard Desmond pledge, I mean, right down to it being simply a motion to change the county's lobbying position, basically, seems very much like a gesture or a signaling exercise, less than an earnest act of governance. Um, I mean, like, how specific were these lobbying instructions going to be? If people want to say that they are not getting a clear understanding of the directives that we are under and what is informing them, then that seems very much like a healthy form of pushback to understand why we're making the decisions and when we might make other decisions, what sort of information we're looking at. But just sort of coming in one day and saying, let's lobby to open things up by May 1st, on the very day that we had our highest death total. As you say, it seems out of touch, but more than that, it seems politically cynical, frankly.
I talked to my doctor. I had a doctor friend who I try to check in with every couple of days now, and his point was, I think, a salient one. It's like, this is a dial. There's, on the one side, there's always going to be the economy pushing, and then on the other side, the virus is going to push back. And it seems like for the next maybe year, 2 years, we're just going to dial back and forth as the virus asserts itself, as the economy asserts itself, and the public pressure and culture asserts itself. And someday, but another friend pointed out, humankind have been through pandemics, and we get through them, and it hopefully happens soon. The way we're going to get through this, though, seems obvious, that we're going to have a much clearer picture of where the virus is, who it's affecting, and we're going to get that through testing. Can't see the virus without an electron microscope, but we can see what it's doing in the community if we can get some actual testing out there. Governor says that's the most important thing, testing and tracing. County says that's the most important thing, but here still in San Diego County, they're only doing about 1,100 tests per day on average. Over the last 7 days, that's the average. But we found out this week, Will Huntsberry, that they could be at local hospitals right now doing 3 to 4 times that, 4,000 tests per day, and they're not. And they don't seem to really have a clear reason why they're not, other than they don't have the guidance, they don't have the strategy. UC San Diego is testing. Everyone who comes into UC San Diego hospitals, they're testing. They're getting about 3% positives. South Bay, they're only testing some of the people who are sick, and they're seeing a spike there, 17% positives. You want a lower positive because that proves that there's a lower prevalence in the community. Will's piece was something. I thought it really opened our eyes into how some bureaucratic confusion may be getting in the way of much more widespread testing, and he put it together in a really authoritative way.
It drove home to me that it's not necessarily something concrete that's standing in the way. The county suggested that they don't have enough protective equipment, and the hospital's pretty uniformly told Will that's not true. It's just, this overarching strategy and guidance that is holding everybody back. And at this point, they all seem to be playing by different rules. Like you said, UCSD is just testing everybody now. We heard from the spokesman from Sharp Healthcare this morning that they have started to go a little bit beyond the county's guidelines and are testing some vulnerable people like pregnant patients and people who have cancer. And also just if a doctor decides for whatever reason that someone should get a test, they have that flexibility. But that's still, more than what the county suggested and less than what UCSD is doing. And so, it's really not consistent across the board.
Yeah, the discrepancy in what the county said and what the hospitals said, to me, indicated that in this loosely congealed system that we have, they had not yet figured out how to move from one phase of the pandemic to another. The early phase where they didn't have enough tests, they're still trying to get their hands around the situation, and you could occupy yourself completely with just testing the very sick people who walked through your doors, had moved on to another phase where that wasn't enough. Not only was it not enough, like you would actually see at a certain point, you'd see your testing rates fall if that was all you continued to do, because fewer and fewer sick people would be coming in, and they had not yet figured out what a more rigorous testing regime looked like, how they would put that together, how it would be structured, who would receive those tests. And so my thought is that the Richard Baileys, Jim Desmonds, and Kristen Gaspars of the world, who are eager and anxious to see the world open up, should direct their frustrations at that system and push. If you want to hold the system accountable, if you want to demand that we do everything in our power to get things open quickly, well, how about
Exactly.
you direct your energy towards getting as many tests done as quickly as possible, covering as broad a swath of the community as possible, and that's how we get there responsibly. It's not a matter of just banging your fist on the table and demanding it. It's a matter of asking the right questions and holding the right people accountable.
Unless you think it's a hoax, right?
That's exactly right. It's getting back to what I was saying before about talking past the problem, hand waving things, and begging the question. Like, if you think the public health directives that are informing this response are at all valid, then you think that we need to increase our testing capability, increase our testing deployment, and move to the next phase in this crisis. If you're just saying, let us out of our homes, liberate San Diego, then it could only mean that you don't think this is necessary.
Yeah, we did a story. So Will has been on this intensely, and I love it. The last week he had done, or was it in 1950? I have no idea when it was, but recently he did a story pointing out how low the average daily tests were. It's gone up since then. But after he did that story, they said they were going to put together a task force. They did put together a task force, but then we were kind of deflated this week to learn that it wasn't meeting until Monday. Like, it's like, if testing is the most important thing and it is the way out of this, then it's a perfectly acceptable pressure to be putting on public leaders to get that figured out. If they could be doing 4,000 tests per day and they just need to meet to decide how that needs to happen, then do that, please, as soon as possible. Fix this.
Do it 10 days ago, right? Yeah, and for everybody who's agitating, either by protesting, here is your target. Here is the system that you need to demand results from.
There is a sort of silver lining in Will's piece that maybe not everybody picked up on, and that's that, we've thrown out this number of 4,000 tests a day is what San Diego County says it's capable of. And he seemed to discover that we could actually have capacity well beyond that. There are a few outside institutions outside of the three major health systems in the county that are capable of performing tests. And then there are other groups like Kaiser Permanente that said that they have additional capacity. And so we could really be closer to this 10,000 tests a day that the county has said we would need to get to. And so, that really emphasizes the pressure to figure out how we can use this capacity that we actually have.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's important because there has been some suggestion, some fatalistic thinking that, well, we'll never be able to get to that level of testing. That sort of broad testing that we need, we can't possibly imagine getting there. But if public health officials say that level is 10,000 and we're already very loosely at 4,000 and have an easy ability to get beyond that, then it's completely within striking distance, especially as hospitals start treating fewer and fewer sick people and therefore have presumably more bandwidth to handle just testing.
Right.
Yeah, get some statisticians into the room, decide what the best random sampling technique is, get out in the community. We were talking yesterday to somebody from New Orleans who they've been putting mobile units out into the community where they think there should be more cases than there are coming and stuff like that. There's ways to do it. Well,
I think all of what we're saying, though, to me, importantly, centers on you don't need to just sit there and take it. If you don't like the situation that we're in and you feel frustrated and put upon by it, there are people you can hold accountable, and there's avenues for direct advocacy towards the government. But maybe it could be a little bit more sophisticated than stomping your feet and identifying the fact that this isn't very much fun.
Yeah. Well, one of the big decisions that could be fascinating is what might happen to many of the homeless residents. We've been clamoring and talking for years about the lack of permanent housing, the loss of single-room occupancy hotels, and other things that may have contributed to this crisis of the homeless and unsheltered population in San Diego. This week, you revealed a big plan, big idea from the City of San Diego and the Housing Commission, which is separate but attached to the City of San Diego. They want to acquire some hotels that might not be in the best financial shape and then turn them into permanent housing. How real is it? Is this an idea that may actually happen? I talked to the mayor about it. He says he's all in. Give us the bones of how it would work and whether it will.
So I think it will happen. Even I had a follow-up story today about some voices of dissent from the plan, but even those voices of dissent are really asking practical questions and raising their hand with some concerns, all of which seem the type of thing you could sort through in the typical course of policymaking. So I do think it will happen. But basically, there's a recognition that the virus, tragic though it is, has created something of an opportunity. Some of these small hotels, like Class C, low-rent hotels, their occupancy is at basically zero, or their vacancy, I should say, is at basically 100%. And that has put the owners of those hotels in a very tough financial position, and that tough financial position probably makes them willing sellers. And so Mayor Faulconer and the Housing Commission have thought of this idea of going out and kickstarting negotiations with a handful of them to see if they can come into lease-to-own deals, deals that would bring them into the Housing Commission's control immediately, and with an opportunity to make them in the Housing Commission's control permanently, where you could convert them into actual apartments. And those could become living units for people who live in the convention center right now, answering that question that we have floated in the past, which is once you acknowledge that you have a responsibility to house people living on the streets in the moment of a pandemic and to keep them from getting the disease or keep them safe from the disease, you've sort of acknowledged that this is a responsibility that is yours beyond that moment of crisis as well. And so it's a potential landing place for those people, so you don't just open the door a month from now and say, okay, the height of the pandemic is over, back on the streets with you. But also beyond that, beyond even the implications of the pandemic, we've been dealing with this housing crisis for years, and at its root, the problem is we don't have enough homes to put all the people who need homes, whether they're homeless or very low-income people at risk of becoming homeless. There just are not enough units available for them. And so potentially acquiring these hotels, and the quote that Faulconer said to me was hundreds and hundreds of hotel rooms. You can potentially do that much quicker and much more cheaply than we have typically done in building new low-income housing units. And so it's basically a policy idea that's at the intersection of the need in their short-term and long-term needs of two different crises and the opportunity presented by our crisis right now.
If you kind of strip it down to the basics, like this idea that we don't have enough places to put people who are homeless and very low income is usually the retort of progressives in the community. So, presumably this is an idea they would like very much, depending on the specifics.
Yeah, and to that point, one of the progressives I spoke to I was just trying to talk to some people on the left and hear what their reaction to this idea was. And Murtaza Baksa-Musa, who works for an organization affiliated with the Building and Trades Council and is a pretty progressive guy who's been around for a lot of these fights. His only concern is that it's not big enough, that they should be acquiring more hotels, and that when they do acquire more hotels, more of them should be focused downtown. So, in the grand scheme of things, I think that's a pretty manageable complaint if you're somebody who's trying to make this happen.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating development. I did ask the mayor about it, and in particular asked him to explain, does he think of the people that he brought into the convention center to shelter now as people the city's in charge of? He kind of danced around that, but said that they are really mobilizing to get them permanent housing, and that's why he is so excited about this. Eventually the convention center probably won't be a homeless shelter, and so there will be an end point, and then what do they do with all those people is a really big, interesting question. Most of the people there right now are people who are in more tightly packed shelters and tents. And so do you send them back there? Do you send them to some sort of permanent housing? Do you just, put them back in the street? There's so many really just historic questions that the city has to answer with regard to that situation. We checked about when the next convention center event was scheduled. There's still one, human resource management professionals, for the end of June. Have a feeling that's not going to happen.
You would think the human resource management professionals would be a little wary of company liability and whatnot.
Yeah, they might have some clue. All right, we're going to take a quick break. On the other side, I'll talk to Mayor Kevin Faulconer about what he's doing right now, the city budget, homelessness, protests, and more. It was a good discussion. Stay with us.
Hey, y'all. I'm Will Huntsberry. I'm an education reporter and one of the hosts of a show called Good Schools for All. It's a podcast all about schools, how they work and how they don't. This season, we'll bring you stories about struggling schools, preschools, and an unprecedented scam that cost California tens of millions of dollars. Catch the new season now, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Well, there are a lot of decisions the city of San Diego and its leaders have to make over the next several months. We are lucky enough today to have the mayor, Kevin Faulconer, join us. Welcome, Mayor.
Scott, it's great to be back with you. Thank you.
Got a long list of questions to get through, so I'm just going to jump right into it. Last week, or I guess yesterday, I have no sense of time, sorry. You went to the city council and you told them that the budget you sent in a week ago was now already out of date, that some of the losses that you need to project for the year need to be added in, $50 million more in cuts. Are we getting to the point where we're going to see drastically different experiences at libraries, rec centers, parks, the things that people rely on? Or are you going to be able to preserve some level of normalcy that way?
No, and I thought it was important, Scott, that as we've gotten these updated numbers, that we let folks know right away. The reality is that the revenues continue to decline, and probably not unexpectedly when we see what the shutdown has been on our economy. Sales tax falling off the cliff. The same with TOT tax. I mean, we've never had a month like the month we just had in San Diego, where we had no conventions. You had that revenue non-existent for hotels, people not going to restaurants, obviously. So that reality is real. And why I wanted to make sure that I updated the council is because we're going to have to make some decisions, to your point, and we haven't had to make before. And we're going to do it in a way that protects what I think are the core essential services, right? Public safety, police and fire, water, sewer, trash. But there's going to be some reductions in other areas. So it is going to be a different budget, unlike any budget that we've ever seen. But I've also said that it's much better that we face that reality now, make some of these decisions now, because that'll put us in a better place to get over this, quote unquote, sooner rather than later. And I want to make a lot of these decisions now. It would be easy, I suppose, Scott, to punt some of those for the next mayor, but that's not what I'm going to do.
Do you think that there will be conventions at the convention center in 2020?
I certainly hope so. But the answer is we don't know. It's been a tough month this month, right? With Pride, with of course Comic-Con, Esri. Those are just really super important events and organizations that A, I think really a part of our spirit of who we are, but B, economically, it leaves a big gap. And so all of this, as we plan to quote reopen, is going to be done. What are the mechanisms? What are the safety precautions we could take? But it is to be determined when we're going to be able to have large groups gathering, as you know.
One of the biggest decisions that you made, there's 3 or 4 I could list off over the last month or so, but one of the biggest ones was to convert the convention center into a homeless shelter. You're calling it shelter to home. And my question for you on that is, what happens to the people at the shelter now? Where do they go? Is the city basically communicating to them that we will get you housing? That's our charge?
Well, I think a couple things. And first, I think the decision to open the center was a good one for not only just the city, but for the individuals involved, obviously. We acted quickly. Why? Because we had a bridge shelter program that was helping, but the physical distancing, you couldn't accomplish that with the bunk beds in our Alpha Bridge Shelter, our Father Joe's, and VBSD. And so our first priority was, let's keep people safe and let's get them safe now. And so to use the convention center with all of we're able to achieve the physical distancing was incredibly important. But I think to your larger point, Scott, this is an opportunity now where we have all of our providers in the same space. We're consolidating staff. We have the Housing Commission, the Regional Task Force for the Homeless, the county folks. This is an opportunity to say, how do we do something different? And what I've challenged all of our folks that are there and working there is, let's look at every single individual and say, what is it that is preventing that person from getting an apartment next week? What are the barriers? What do we have to do differently to do that? And so, exits are occurring, obviously, even as we speak. But to see the sense of, I would say, really the enthusiasm and momentum from a lot of our providers who know that this is a temporary setting, but what are we going to do differently that says, how do we get more people out of the convention center and into a permanent place of their own? That's the opportunity. But I think it's also, as I said, it will really make a huge difference in the ecosystem that we're trying to set up, not just now, but for the long-term future.
But you wouldn't consider those individuals, those residents, charges of the city? Like they're not the city's responsibility right now, that getting them into a home is your obligation?
Those are our citizens. Why we stood up the bridge shelters to begin with is these are San Diegans that needed help.
Yeah.
And I think it really validates the approach that we took early in San Diego on setting up the bridge shelter system that other cities have emulated across the state, is because you need a place for somebody to go right off the street, to get them into that safe, clean, sanitary environment, to start matching them to resources, to get them as I said, the help and the support that they need. So by combining a lot of these services now at the convention center in combination with the county, with the VA, like I said, nobody's been in the same situation before and under the same roof. I think that's going to, if we do it right, that's going to be a very positive result. And my goal, I think everybody's goal, is let's get people housed, not return them back to the bridge shelters.
Speaking of housing, one of the ideas that was really, really interesting was this thing that the Housing Commission is discussing. Our reporter Andrew Keats did a story about it, to potentially buy some of these hotels that are having trouble right now and convert them into permanent housing. Are you into that? Are you going to do that? What's the barriers and what's the plan?
Absolutely. Why? Because what do we need? We need housing. We need capacity. And that has been one of the things that continues to hold us back. You all are very familiar with how long it takes, A, to build something new from the ground up, and B, how expensive that is, particularly in California. And so our ability to potentially own for the housing commissions new product and new inventory from these hotels that they didn't have before becomes incredibly important. And so I actually really applaud how quickly everybody has worked together. Regional Task Force for the Homelessness, the Housing Commission, Supervisor Fletcher, Chris Ward, Councilmember Ward of the RTFH. We have one goal. How can we increase the capacity and how can we get people housed, cut through, as I said, some of the bureaucracies, but adding some of these hotels can be a huge part of eventual success.
Taking ownership of a building like that and making it something people can move into, sounds like something makes sense, but also the city's had some trouble acquiring these big buildings and making use of them. Is that something that you feel confident the city could actually pull off?
Yeah, look, it has to be done right. And I think as you've set up the process at the Housing Commission, they're doing all of their due diligence on the properties, the price, et cetera. And all of that will obviously be coming forward. That the council will have the opportunity to weigh in as it should. Again, we have a goal of how do we increase capacity to get an apartment so we can get somebody off the street and help control our own destiny. The Housing Commission acquires buildings and properties all the time. They're very well suited to do this. I think if there's any silver lining, Scott, of the current crisis that we're going through, is that we may have an opportunity for the Housing Commission to increase that with some of these hotels sooner rather than later. And I will tell you, because I'm on calls with mayors across the state several times a week, every other city is looking to do exactly this for the obvious reasons. I think we're going to be a statewide leader because we're moving expeditiously, because we have a need, but because we've also, we have everybody rowing in the same direction. That doesn't always happen. And I think that's a hallmark of where we are right now in San Diego in terms of homelessness.
We did a story about some of the homeless residents who were concerned that they were still facing some enforcement actions by the city police on some of the streets as they were, hiding from some of the rain that they faced, other things like that. What is your take on whether police should be doing that kind of thing right now, and how that's been carried out?
No, I appreciate that. And look, and our officers do a great job, and particularly those folks in our homeless outreach team. Every single encounter that they have with somebody who's on the street always begins with, "Can I get you a shelter bed tonight?" And that's how it should be, because we have one goal. We want to actually get people indoors into that clean and safe environment and not allow somebody to be on a sidewalk where they're exposed to the elements and where they're going to have all kinds of other issues that develop. So I think our department does an extraordinarily phenomenal job of trying to help folks. And we've seen it, I think, Scott, particularly in the last 2 weeks, going back to what's happening at the convention center. After we moved everybody in from the bridge shelters, the outreach efforts that are happening now, it's all incentive based. It's like, we have a place for you to come. We want you to get safe. We don't want you to be out here. And to see that has increased by 200 folks just in the last 2 weeks alone, I think speaks volumes that approach is working. We got to continue that. And I think the public expects that.
But there's still a role for actual citations, ticketing, enforcement.
There's always going to be a role for enforcement, and it's always going to be, complaint driven. We're going to enforce the reality of, we get complaints, unfortunately, of folks, out in the street, whether they're doing heroin, methamphetamine, et cetera. There's always going to be that role for enforcement, and I think rightfully so.
One of the other areas of enforcement that was interesting was this question of the protesters that gathered downtown last week to reopen San Diego. And at first, I think the chief of police, Chief Nisleit, made it clear that he wasn't going to go after him. But now we've heard that there is a leader of the protesters that is being sought for potential violations. What's the situation there? What's your perspective on whether people can do First Amendment activities like that?
Yeah, I think it's important that you're able to do your First Amendment activity. And I think it's incredibly important that, our police department strike that balance. And I think they do a very good job of that. Officers are often put in a very difficult situation when you're dealing with different types of protests. But that's nothing new in a city our size. I mean, we have protests large and small quite often. And I think from an overall perspective, our police department, our men and women out there do a remarkable and phenomenal job. They're going to continue to do that job. We're likely to have other protests. We've seen this across the country right now. And so it's important that while folks are exercising their First Amendment rights, which they have the ability to do, that they're also doing it in a manner that keeps everybody safe with physical distancing. That's incredibly important. And so the two, I don't think, are mutually exclusive as the police department strikes that tough, but I think necessary balance.
And so finding that woman, going after her, is appropriate in your opinion?
I think they're going to have to make the decisions on a case-by-case basis based upon the facts on the ground as they see them. It'll wind its way through the process as it rightfully should. But again, I think we want to take an overall perspective that says we're going to support people's right for free speech, and we're also going to do everything we can to keep people safe.
The CDC had mentioned in a guidance that it didn't want people to disrupt, or enforcement officers to disrupt, some of these encampments. Your office took the position that what you were doing on the streets wasn't enforcing sort of encampments as they described. We got a follow-up from them that seemed like they were describing it that way. What's your take on that?
We've really had a concerted effort, and I think you hit the nail on the head, of keeping people safe. Not allowing large-scale encampments to develop in San Diego. We've seen what happens, Scott, when that occurs. You think back to hepatitis A, how many years ago? We don't allow large-scale encampments in San Diego because it's not a safe and clean environment. And so I think the setup of the bridge shelters, the setup of the convention center, all that has been done with care, with compassion, but with an overall aspect of we want to keep people healthy and safe. And letting somebody out on the street is not a safe environment. And so I think that, again, part of why this ecosystem that we have created, and it's been so important to do it, with everybody in the same direction, not getting into silos, which is what we used to have. You have the city, the county, the regional task force, everybody working together. That has made a huge difference. On the streets, you see the difference from what it used to be several years ago. We're not going back to those days. It doesn't work. That's not fair for the individuals that have been out in the street. They deserve better.
Okay, I just have a couple more. I know you need to go soon. Just quickly, it looks like the city's eligible for about $248 million in funds from the CARES Act, the Federal Recovery Act. Are we going to get that money?
We got it.
Oh, you did?
Yes, it's in the bank.
Wow.
Imagine that. And I believe your dollar amount is correct. It's somewhere going to be around $250 million. I think it's 248.
Well, that makes the budgeting a lot easier, right?
Well, now it all depends on what you can use it for, right?
Okay.
And so part of what we are dealing with is what are the requirements, and we're spending a lot of time on that because we're really trying to drill down into what can you use it for and what you can't use it for. The Treasury Department and others have come out and said it all has to be COVID related. And so, okay, so how are we going to do this? They said you can't use it for this, you can't use it for that. But as we sort through some of that, I think it's also important, Scott, to, as we talked about at the beginning here today, a single check from Washington is not going to get us out of the economic crisis that we're in now. You tell me when everything is going to get back to normal in terms of tax revenues, right? This is going to be an issue we're going to face for quite some time. And so I'm really going to make sure that we're not trying to use one-time expenses one-time revenues, a check from Washington, to help temporarily solve a problem that's going to be an ongoing expense for the city. So that's why we have to make some of those decisions now. I think we will have more clarity on what we can use the dollars for in the coming weeks. And obviously that'll be part of the balancing act that we do on how we can use it and when we can use it.
Okay, last question on open space. When can I surf again, sir?
Well, you might have seen we came up with a plan yesterday, Scott, with all the coastal mayors on how we would reopen the beaches, do it in a coordinated fashion, and a phased approach. It was developed by the lifeguards, all from all the coastal cities, who really spent a lot of time on it. With the overall goal is how do we make sure it's going to be safe for folks to get back on the beach and in the water, and also, of course, safe for our men and women that are lifeguards protecting us. I think the good news is that plan had unanimous support from all of the lifeguard entities, all of the beach city mayors, which we talked about yesterday. If we continue to see the positive trends, the county will, at some point overturn the order in terms of getting back into the water. And when that happens, we will all be ready to go with a coordinated beach opening effort that's in phases and that's in safe. So I would say to you, hang in there. It's probably coming, sooner rather than later if we keep up the positive trends that we've seen.
Mayor Kevin Faulconer, thanks for joining us. All right, before we go, be sure to check out in your feed our bonus episode this week. I spoke with an old friend, Ramsey Green. He's in charge of infrastructure and operations at the city of New Orleans, City Hall there. He had some really good perspective from another city about how they're handling their parks, their schools, their testing. Enjoyed getting that other perspective from a different city and catching up with a friend. That'll drop in your feed soon. Thanks for listening to the Voice of San Diego podcast. It's the most popular public affairs podcast recorded in our respective homes, and this week, partly in the great Voice of San Diego podcast studio. That's the studio sponsored by the Bob Nelson Charitable Fund. Thank you, Bob Nelson Charitable Fund. I'm Scott Lewis, CEO and editor-in-chief. Andrew Keats is assistant editor. Sarah Libby's managing editor. And we will talk to you next week.